Call of the Bully, Chapter 21, A Rat on the Shore. 12 aluminum canoes lined a sandy stretch along the bank of the Drown-A-Lot River. Each team, along with the Periwinkles, Mrs. Lutz-Kraut, Survival Steve, Mr. Cramps, a host of other camp personnel, and a few random campers, had made the long van trek to the starting point of the big race. The day was hot, which added to the tension that hung over the gathering. Mr. Periwinkle adjusted his pith helmet. We're all ready and set to start the race. You know the rules. Today, you will paddle for 10 miles to Skull Rock. You'll spend the night there. Along the way, Mrs. Periwinkle and I will watch you from various checkpoints, which are accessible by jeep. Mr. Cramps will be in the Zodiac motorboat, and Steve will be in his own canoe, in case you need assistance out in the water. I didn't like the sound of that, and wondered what kind of assistance we might need. I didn't like any of this. A couple of months ago, I had never heard of Camp Wyoming. Now its fate rested on my shoulders, all because Mrs. Lutz-Kraut was prepared to stop at nothing to get rich. She stood behind Mr. Periwinkle, looking in my direction. I couldn't tell if she was frowning or smiling. All I knew was that she was up to something. But what? Mr. Periwinkle continued, At Skull Rock, we will record your time and start you accordingly tomorrow morning for the final leg of the race. He went on blabbing about the rules, and I found myself zoning out, like I did in school. I looked off into the woods. I wasn't the only one not paying attention. Woo appeared to be singing with several frogs. He saw me and shouted, They're doing bebop! As usual, I didn't know what he was saying and just smiled. He turned back to the frogs and yelled, Go, man, go! Rodney, please pay attention, Mr. Periwinkle scolded. As you might imagine, this is all very important. Now, tonight we will have a cookout, and then we'll split into two groups. The boys will be sleeping in an area with me, Mr. Cramps, and Steve. And Mrs. Periwinkle and Mrs. Lutz-Kraut will be camping with the girls. Your sleeping gear and tents have already been delivered to the site. The food will be dropped off later. Under other circumstances, the race actually sounded like a great time. Too bad there was so much riding on it. Okay, does anyone have any questions? Antsy to get started, I prayed no one did. Unfortunately, Skip raised his hand. He was standing next to his big jerk canoe partner, Todd. Mr. Periwinkle, he began. Yes, Skip. Suddenly he grabbed his stomach and fell to the floor. Oh, no! What's the matter? Mrs. Lutz-Kraut yelled, rushing over to the Algonquin canoe. What is it, son? Son? I had never heard her speak nicely to anyone. Something was up. Skip rolled around on the ground, holding his stomach. Todd leaned over him. It's his stomach, Mr. Periwinkle. There's no way he can race. We'll need a substitute canoer. How dreadful, Mrs. Lutz-Kraut said. But a look on her face, combined with some pretty poor acting by Skip and Todd, told me this was all fake. Todd, she asked, do you have anyone in mind to replace Skip? Well, now that you mention it, what about, Magnus? Mr. Periwinkle jumped in. Well, hold on a minute. This is a camper race. Magnus is a counselor. He's twice your size. He's not allowed to participate. Percy, Mrs. Lutz-Kraut observed, I see you haven't consulted the rules. They clearly state counselors are allowed to race. Helga, the rules say they don't. Mrs. Lutz-Kraut yanked a book from her purse and thrust it at Mr. Periwinkle. It says so right here on page 43. Mr. Periwinkle looked. This is nothing. The rules have been crossed out, and someone wrote new ones in pencil. They've been changed. Changed by me as camp director, she snapped. I am majority owner, and I feel it's much safer to have some counselors out on the water. If you're worried about fairness, you may certainly replace Joshua or Rodney with Woo. Everyone turned to look at Woo. He was still hunched over the frog singing. Mr. Periwinkle bit his lip. Magnus spoke up next. Good thing I just happened to have my paddle. He pulled out a cello case from the back of the van. Was he going to join Lou in a duet? He set the case on the ground, and I leaned forward to watch. He clicked open the clasps and lifted the lid. A shiny, dark wooden paddle lay surrounded by purple velvet. This beauty helped me win the Scandinavian Rafting Championship on the Solta River 3 years in a row. Mrs. Lutzkraut acted surprised. A rafting champion? Who would have guessed? My, Percy, you've really recruited a talented staff this year. Mr. Periwinkle didn't respond. Instead, he gathered Allison, Josh, and me to the side. His face looked very tense, and I understood why. Todd and Tabitha were already heavy favorites. Adding a Scandinavian rafting champ made them unbeatable. He swallowed hard and cleared his throat. I could tell a big speech was coming. Okay, this is it, he began. It's time. Remember, they're bigger than you. They're faster and more experienced. They've canoed longer and they fight dirtier. If he's trying to build our confidence, he's going about it in a weird way, I thought. Not one Cherokee team has ever won, and the Algonquins almost never lose. Right now, Vegas has you listed as 1,000-to-1 underdog. Now that Magnus was in their canoe, that didn't seem high enough. Furthermore, if you don't win, everything will be destroyed. All these trees you see in every direction will be cut down. All the animals will die. And the world will be one step closer to global warming and ruin. Simply put, this is the most important canoe race in the history of mankind. His eyes looked wet, and his skin was changing color. But then he exhaled and seemed to gather himself a little. Anyway, the important thing is to have fun. He gave us each a pat on the back and walked off into the woods, where he hugged a tree and collapsed. Well, that certainly made me feel a lot better, I said to Allison. Yeah, real inspiring. Okay, racers, into your boats, Mrs. Lutzkraut called. She was holding a cap gun and was ready to start the race. If canoes had names, ours should have been the SS Impossible. Josh, Allison, and I climbed in. We were about to embark on the most important canoe race in the history of mankind, or something like that. Satisfied that she had everyone's attention, Mrs. Lutzkraut shouted, Get on your mark! Get set! Go! She fired her cap gun. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I think it was pointed right at me. We pushed the canoe into the water. The sand made a grating noise as it scraped the bottom of the aluminum. We banged into other canoes and paddles as we jostled to get out into the river. Josh sat in the front, swinging his paddle wildly. I couldn't be sure if he was trying to whack a turtle or clobber Todd, but either way, Tabitha was getting splashed and screaming at him from the Algonquin boat. This had Allison laughing, and I would have joined her, but Mr. Periwinkle's encouraging words, Everything will die, echoed in my ears. I yelled, Josh, start paddling. He looked back at me with a vague expression. Remember what Steve showed you? As I said this, I mimicked the basic pull with my paddle, and Josh slowly began to nod. I nodded too, with encouragement. Josh's paddle dipped into the water, and off we went. Once he got the hang of it, it didn't take long for us to find a rhythm. Allison sat in the middle of the canoe on the floor. The middle person doesn't paddle, but can usually switch when one of the two paddlers gets tired. The rear of the canoe, where I sat, is reserved for the person who does the steering. And while I may never become a sailor, I took to canoeing fairly quickly. True to his promise, Survival Steve had spent the past few days working on us with a variety of paddle strokes and techniques. Josh, on the other hand, learned only one. He could paddle the basic front pull stroke, but that was enough. His tremendous strength made this one basic paddle stroke long and swift. I felt him pull us along. I dug deep in the water, also pulling hard, and I kept us going straight down the middle of the river. It wasn't long before 10 canoes fell behind us, which was encouraging but not good enough. It was the 11th canoe that mattered. I glanced over at it. Todd was in the front, pulling long, even strokes. While he wasn't able to rival Josh's power, it was obvious he knew what he was doing. And then there was Magnus. It was easy to believe he had won those championships. Being a big, full-grown counselor, he had every bit of Josh's strength. As I watched his fancy paddle caress the surface of the water, I realized that he also possessed all of Steve's expertise. Tabitha sat in the middle and occasionally gave me a nasty look. For over an hour, we battled hard, grunting from the strain. I couldn't help notice that Todd and Magnus seemed to be struggling too. Catching my eye, Todd yelled, "Give it up, Rathbone!" I ignored him, but he continued, "Guess what? With the profits from construction, my dad's getting me a Ferrari." Tabitha almost fell out of the canoe. "Really, Toddy? Your own Ferrari? Will it be red?" "Sure," he answered, smirking back at me. I wished I had some snappy reply, but my mouth was dry from breathing hard. And as much as it disgusted me, I knew Tabitha would look good in the front seat of a Ferrari. Besides, what could I offer her? A ride in my dad's old Honda? We were beginning to fall back. My shoulders and back burned, and I fought off annoying thoughts of Todd and Tabitha zooming by in a red sports car. I eyed the back of Allison's head. Why couldn't she be some big Scandinavian canoe girl who could give me a few minutes rest? All Allison ever managed to do when we practiced was drop the paddle overboard and scream. Really, other than making the canoe heavier, she wasn't doing anything. She was, as Survival Steve put it, dead weight. Then she turned back to me. Her red hair spun out over the water as she turned. I could see her brown eyes through her sunglasses and thought, "That's the prettiest dead weight I have ever seen." She smiled and said, "Keep going, you're doing great. Did I ever tell you you look cute canoeing?" "Thanks," Josh grunted. Allison and I both laughed. I shrugged off my previous feelings. I felt happy she was with us, and the Ferrari thoughts didn't bother me much after that. What bothered me was the fact that, try as we might, we couldn't keep pace with Todd and Magnus. And then we came around a bend and caught our first break. Several yellow ropes were tied across the river. A big red sign stated, "Danger, waterfall, portage to right." A portage meant we had to paddle to the side and carry our canoe on land for a while. If you ignored the sign and somehow pushed under the ropes, a 20-foot drop and probable death awaited you. I figured if we couldn't beat them on the water, maybe we could pass them on the land. Todd reached the bank first. We were about 10 yards behind. The three of us jumped out, pulled the canoe high up on the bank, rolled it over, and hoisted it over our heads. They say aluminum is a wonder metal because it's strong and light. It wasn't long, however, before the wonderful lightness faded and my arms and shoulders began to burn from the strain of constant lifting without a break. Allison, to her credit, held up the middle of the canoe and grunted right along with us. To carry a canoe any distance, you have to put it over your head and hold it shoulder height as you walk. Our heads would occasionally crack inside the canoe. Having your head stuck within a canoe makes vision difficult, and right away we were stumbling and going off course. But that wasn't the worst part. Unfortunately, all the mosquitoes in Ohio suddenly decided to pay us a visit. They announced their assault with their famous high-pitched noise. One of them circled my head, bounced off my forehead and neck, and he landed on the tip of my nose. It sat there for a second, looking me in the eye. I went cross-eyed, returning the stare. I'm sure it was my imagination, but it seemed to be smiling. And then, chomp! I felt the little sting, and even worse, I saw all of the little vampire's friends zooming in under the canoe's metal edge to join the fun. The attack was on, and it was a one-sided battle. If I used my hand to whack them, I dropped the canoe on my skull. It wasn't long before all three of us were cursing and whining. The mosquitoes, realizing their victims were helpless, charged with greater ferocity. I tried shaking my head and blowing hard puffs of air at them, but nothing worked. I was close to going insane. In the end, it was Allison who saved us. "Boys, I'm going to let go. The load will get heavier, but I'll squash the mosquitoes." She let go and started slapping. "Slap harder," I yelled. "Get the one on my neck." "And my legs," Josh called out. After about 2 minutes of Allison waving her arms and slapping us silly, the bite slowed and my sanity returned. Not everyone, however, had found relief. From up ahead we heard Magnus shout, "These bugs drive me crazy," followed by a large boom. We paused and lifted the canoe higher to see. The Algonquin canoe had fallen, rolled down a hill and gotten wedged between two boulders. Magnus was jumping around and scratching at his face. "The canoe!" Todd shouted. "We have to get it! These bugs! No bugs like these in the fjords. Magnus tore off toward the river. With Allison managing our bug problem, this was our chance to pull ahead. We hurried past our Algonquin enemies, and I caught a glimpse of Magnus plunging his head underwater. Tabitha was whining about a broken fingernail, and Todd was busy trying to remove a mud stain from his shirt. They definitely appeared to be a defeated team. We reached the riverbank below the waterfall and resumed the race. Once underway, I looked back. Their canoe was stuck in an awkward spot, and Tabitha and Todd were struggling to get Magnus out of the water. The lead was now ours. Allison turned to me from her spot in the middle and yelled, "It would take a miracle for them to catch us today." You could see she was happy and proud. I smiled back, but it was only for her benefit. She had never spent an entire school year in Mrs. Lutzkraut's class. I knew it was only a matter of time before our luck changed. We were still paddling hard, but slower and more consistently. It had been an hour since we left the Algonquins. The Drown-A-Lot River had lots of twists and turns. There was no way of knowing how far ahead we were, or how much time the Algonquins had lost trying to free their canoe. Allison, who was proving her worth again and again, spotted Mr. and Mrs. Periwinkle on the side of the river. Mr. Periwinkle was running and jumping along the bank. "You have to leave! Way to go! Only 2 miles left to Skull Rock! Woo!" Josh and Allison waved at him and cheered back. I didn't join them. I was watching the opposite bank. Mrs. Lutzkraut had emerged from behind a boulder. She had her hands on a walkie-talkie, and I could see her mouth moving a mile a minute. I noticed a large bag of some kind by her side. She caught my gaze. I had hoped to see panic in her eyes, but they held an evil confidence that shook me. "Paddle faster!" I hollered. The canoe wobbled as Josh's thrusts increased. I knew something was about to happen. I could just feel it. I looked around. The river was calm. Bugs danced on the surface of the water. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe nothing bad was coming. And then I heard it. Vroom! It was a motor, and it was gaining on us. I looked back at a bend in the river just in time to see a rubber motorboat zooming our way. Cramps! I knew he'd be making an appearance. His comb-over flapped in the wind like a weird pirate flag as he bore down on us. Would he actually ram us? I didn't think he would go that far, but I also knew who we were up against. Lutzkraut and her henchmen were determined to win at any cost. Josh turned back and smiled. "Cool." "No, Josh," I shouted. "Definitely not cool." Cramps was about to smash us, but veered to the right at the last second, sending a huge wake over the bow of the canoe and knocking Josh back into Allison. The canoe rocked violently. I had to lean in and balance to keep it from going over. "Did I get you kids wet?" Cramps yelled with an evil smile. "Gee, that's too bad. Don't tell your mommies." He gave a little laugh and zoomed away up the river. Allison was sitting in 6 inches of water. "Forget about him," she suggested. "Let's keep going. You two paddle and I'll bail out the water." We resumed paddling, but with the added water, the boat was heavier and harder to move. Fortunately, like some big plow horse, Josh didn't seem to notice and never tired. He kept pulling us along. Well, was that the best Lutzkraut could do? I wondered. It would take more than a little water to stop me from saving Camp by Me. I could feel confidence filling my chest. I was beginning to wonder whether Todd, Magnus, and Tabitha had gotten their canoe free from the boulders. "Look!" Allison screamed. She was pointing in back of me. My confidence turned to indigestion as I whirled around, half expecting to see Lutzkraut bearing down on us in a gunboat. The reality was almost as bad. Coming around the bend was Todd's pink shirt and perfect hair. Seeing me looking back, he and Tabitha gave little waves. Allison bailed faster, and Josh and I dug in for more frantic pulling. Already I could feel blisters forming on my hands. My back and shoulders and arms and, well, everywhere ached. We still led by more than 100 yards, but despite all our effort, the lead had dwindled. I couldn't believe how fast they were gaining, and yet they hardly seemed to be paddling. "There's Skull Rock!" Allison yelled, pointing ahead. She was right, and I immediately saw why they called it that. An ancient rock the size of a house stuck out from a cliff above the river. It looked just like a human skull. Below it, Tents dotted the shore. My stomach did a nervous flip as I realized that this is where we would be spending the night. Eat our wake, losers, Todd yelled. I jumped up and nearly tipped the canoe. How could they be right next to us already? Magnus and Tabitha weren't even paddling. They were busy lifting something into a duffel bag. What's in the bag? I called over to Tabitha, trying to regain my calm. I wanted to act like I was unconcerned they had overtaken us. Suddenly you remember how to talk, she sneered, zipping the bag shut. It was then that I realized I had seen the bag before. I was sure it was the one I had seen Mrs. Loosekraut carrying earlier. I was about to ask when Magnus gripped his paddle and swung it over his head like a deranged Viking. Yah! He roared, smashing it onto the water's surface. A great splash shot our way and hit me in my open mouth. I spit out the river water. As they pulled away, Todd yelled back, Hey, Rathbone, you really did eat our wake. What a loser. I could only gape, dumbfounded. The three of them didn't even look tired. For a few seconds, Josh, Allison, and I stared blankly. There was nothing we could do. And this was nothing new for Josh, of course, but Allison and I were coming to the same conclusion. We'd somehow lost the day's competition. Come on, let's get to camp, she said sadly. Exhausted, we continued the rest of the way in silence, finally paddling up to Skull Rock a full 4 minutes behind the Algonquin canoe. With our big lead lost, it was doubtful we would catch them tomorrow. In fact, it was looking doubtful that anyone but construction workers would be visiting Camp Waimea next summer. And that is the end of the chapter.